So I'm here in Franklin, Tennessee, hanging out in the middle of the woods outside of the Sanctuary. And the Sanctuary is the name of the meeting place that my great friend Dan Miller has on his property. And in today's vlog, I want to talk to you real quickly about how I first met Dan Miller. Dan Miller is the author of the book 48 Days to the Work You Love, and he is responsible for completely and radically altering my mindset around the idea of getting paid to do work. See, a long time ago, I had this mindset that thought the more you hate your job or the more difficult your job is, the more you should get paid, right? At least that's the way I thought until I read Dan's book, which informed me that there's an entire universe of people out there who are paid extremely well to do things that are aligned with their gifts, their talents, and more importantly, their passions. That there are people out there who are making a great living doing work that they love. To say that I became a huge fan of Dan Miller and his message after reading his book, listening to his podcast on a weekly basis, and having it radically alter my life is quite an understatement. The reality is that he was the closest thing in my life to a celebrity. One week I was on my podcast and I was telling my audience, I said, guys, I'm gonna set some goals. And one of those goals that I wanna set, and you're gonna see a theme in these vlogs, is that I'm a very goal-oriented person these days. But one of the goals that I had set for myself, and I told my audience about in that podcast, was I want to meet Dan Miller. Have a one-on-one conversation where it's just the two of us, and I would love to be able to tell him how much of a profound impact he's had on my life personally, and more specifically, I want to share with him how I've been able to take the impact and influence he's had on my life, and how I've been able to use that to influence the lives of tens of thousands of people around the world. And then I said, if I'm throwing goals out there, if I could get him as a guest on my podcast, that would be awesome as well. Well, I published that podcast episode, and within 48 hours, my friend Andy Traub emails me and says, hey Cliff, I just listened to your podcast. I saw that you have a goal of interviewing Dan for your podcast. I can make that happen. I'm a close personal friend of his. You want to do it next week? I can get that on the schedule for Dan if you'd like. And I'm like, really? And he said, absolutely. And well, a week later, Dan Miller was a guest on my podcast. So I interviewed Dan on the podcast, and then afterwards, Dan stayed on the phone with me for a little bit, and he said, hey, I would like to set up a consulting call with you. Now, this blew my mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, heck yeah, I would love to do a consulting call with you. He says, I'd like to talk to you about how things are going with my podcast. So we scheduled the call, and the thing is I thought he really wanted a consulting call about his podcast. Turns out that, well, of course, Dan helps people create work that they love, and that entails for a lot of people starting their own businesses. And these are people who would love to market their businesses in the most effective way possible. And of course, having an audio podcast is the most effective way possible to build your brand. And so a lot of people were listening to Dan's podcast. They were being inspired to create businesses, and now they wanted to market those businesses with a podcast just like Dan does so effectively. And they were asking him all the time, Dan, how do I do a podcast? So it turns out that Dan was actually wanting to set up a consulting call with me to kind of test me out to see how I handle myself in consulting work and coaching work. But I did not know this. I literally thought that he was looking for some advice about his podcast. So it came time for the call. And we got on the call and he says, hey, Cliff, tell me what you think about my podcast. I said, okay, here's the deal. You know how I feel about, just the fact that you and I are having this conversation. And I have some thoughts that could really help. But if I share what I really feel, I'm afraid that it could potentially damage any potential relationship that we might have. And he goes, Cliff, just don't worry, just lay it on me. And I said, well, Dan, as you know, through our conversation in the podcast interview, I've sent thousands of people to buy your book. And I get tons of emails all the time from people say, Cliff, wow, thank you so much for telling me about 48 Days to the Work You Love. Now, I've also sent thousands of people to your podcast, and I would say that 8, maybe even 9 out of 10 people who have told me that they checked out your podcast, they say, Cliff, I totally understand why you love Dan's podcast, but I subscribed to it, listened to a couple episodes, and I had to quit because his audio quality is so terrible that it was painful to listen to. And I told Dan that, you know, unfortunately, I feel the same way about the audio quality. It's painful to listen to, but your content is so amazing that I've just put up with it. Dan said to me, he says, listen, hey, thank you so much for just being so honest. He goes, I don't find your feedback surprising at all. In fact, I've had plenty of people who have emailed me and told me the same thing. And in fact, I was thinking about reaching out to you anyway, but he goes, tell me, Cliff, what do you think I can do about it? What would you suggest? And I started to share with him all kinds of different stuff that he could do, different pieces of equipment, different ways to edit the podcast so that you're not destroying your audio quality in the post-production process. He says, well, what do you use in your studio? And I told him, because he says, hey, how about this? Are you available this weekend? And I'm like, sure. I didn't even look at my calendar. He says, so Joanne, my wife, is going to be out of town. Why don't you go ahead and order all the gear that you use in your studio and bring that all down to my house here in Franklin, Tennessee, and you can stay in my guest room. And we'll go out and see a show down here in Nashville, and then the next day, all day, I'll wipe my calendar and you can set up my own professional sound studio here at the sanctuary. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I will be there. And so we didn't talk about price. We didn't talk about anything. I'm just like, hey, I'm going to Nashville this weekend. I came down to Nashville and I hooked up his gear. We had the most amazing time. And that began a friendship between myself and Dan Miller that to this day, I just can't even believe how blessed I am. Just the friendship that I have with him one-on-one is amazing. But what happened after that was that, well, he started referring people to me. And as a result of that relationship with Dan Miller, after I came back, within, I think, 3 weeks, my income tripled, and I began to get to the place where my coaching and consulting was booked 2 to 3 weeks in advance. And it was the most insane, busy time of my life, but it was the most exciting time of my life. It was coming right out of some really desperate times in my business, and my life has never been the same since. It's through Dan Miller that I met Michael Hyatt, who then, oh my gosh, the amount of blessings that have come into my life as a result of the relationship that I have with Michael Hyatt. There have been times when I've told people, I said, listen, if I were to look at my income and look at all the different people who are paying me for things, I could probably trace back 80 to 90% of my income to 3 different people. And if I wanted to, I could probably trace back about all of those to one person, and that would be Dan Miller, because of the fact that, you know, where did those other influencers meet me? Through Dan Miller. And all of that because one day I decided to set myself a goal. I would love to meet Dan Miller. I'd love to be able to tell him how much of an influence and impact he's had on my life as a mentor virtually, and then for him to actually become a real mentor, face-to-face, business advisor, close confidant. It's incredible. And my wife and I are down here in Nashville for the Soul to Soul concert for Faith Hill and Tim McGraw. And I said, Dan, I'm wrapping up my last day of podcasting A to Z on Friday, August 4th. Do you mind if I come out to the sanctuary and work that day and use up your Wi-Fi? And he says, come on out. So anyway, I just wanted to share that story with you today. That's my vlog for the day. My friends, set yourself goals. You never know who's listening out there, what connections you can make, and just one person can change your life for the better.